Well, good evening, everybody. It is a little bit after 5 o'clock on the 28th day of October, and I'm glad that you've joined me for the Wyoming Union Torah study, Chumash with Rashi Plus. I'm going to talk a little bit about the passage that we're about to look at and about what it is that I plan to do in the next couple of minutes. The passage is from Genesis chapter 15, and it occurs right after an account of Abraham killing off kings from Mesopotamia who attacked what today is the Dead Sea area. And there is a possibility that there's some historicity to this material. People like to think that Chedor LaOmer is an identifiable king of Elam. That's about the right time for Abraham. And some people used to associate Amraphel with Hammurabi, a king of ancient Babylonia, and they all make sense. I don't really know, nor know what people think about today, nor is it relevant to our discussion of this topic. Genesis 15 has a very interesting mystic vision. It was covered in my mysticism class in a passage of 5 or 10 pages in a book by Marvin Sweeney. And it would be covered in just about any document, any treatment of this material. In this passage, it has Abraham appealing to God, saying, you promised me an awful lot of stuff, but I don't have any children. And what does the promise mean? And then by the end of the passage, Abraham is put into it. He sacrifices some animals, cuts them up, is put into a deep sleep, has a very, very strange vision to our minds today. And the promise to Abraham is reiterated. Right after that, we have one more narrative in Genesis 16, in which Abraham begins to beget children, although we find that the child that was begotten in chapter 16 was, according to the Jewish tradition, not the promised child. That child was Ishmael, and again, it's not part of my interest today to go into that and to look at the whole bit of Ishmael versus Isaac, as interesting as that might be for us. I'm just going to look at Genesis chapter 15. I do want to mention that Professor Sweeney has some very interesting interpretations. I will refer to some of them when we come to them. And he also has some references to Mesopotamian material, which I think helps understand it, but unlike some of the papers that he references, he is very much situated in this book in a traditional Jewish world, at least in part, and has an even better reference to solve a very strange mystical image problem, which puts the text more in line with some of the other texts, which are appropriate to look at in the context of the history of Jewish mysticism. I hope I'm not boring you. I hope I'm not too erudite to give this little introduction. Hopefully it will become clear. What I do in these programs is I like to have a basic approach of Chumash with Rashi, the biblical text with the most important medieval Jewish commentator, and then I like to look at some other sources after that. I get this text from Chabad and copy it, do a minimum amount of editing. Last week I had somebody, or 2 weeks ago, somebody asked me about the marks that I put in divine names to basically follow the Jewish tradition of not having fully spelled out divine names except in Torah books or in prayer books and so on, but not in sheets that are likely to be disposed of with disrespect. The material that is in white is the actual biblical text, and the material that's shaded is the commentary by Rashi, and I omitted some of Rashi's commentary already, and we'll skip over some of it as we read through this material. Well, I'd like you to look at verse 1 and 2, let's say verses 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And you may read it in Hebrew or in English. I, by the way, have looked at the Arabic, but I did not copy the Arabic into my presentation today. So, what do you think is going on in verses 1 through 5?
Mm-hmm.
Can you all see the text? Can you read it?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, since I have lots of volunteers to say what they think is going on,
I'll
so
volunteer. You want me to volunteer? I can volunteer.
yeah, just give me the straight meaning of the Bible, just a summary.
Yeah. So Abraham was concerned. He's done all these things that he believes God's wanted him to do, including the last battle with the kings and rescuing Lot and so on and so forth. And he's wondering if he's going to get rewarded anymore because he wants to have children. He doesn't have any children to carry on for him. And he believes that maybe his main servant, will become the head of his household and take over from him, and his line will be carried on, but not Abraham's line will be carried on. And so he's concerned, and he wants to know, is God going to let him have children or not? So he'll be able to have he'll have a son that can inherit from him. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's a great summary. And let's look at some of the medieval developments. The medieval developments, I should say, they already go back to late antiquity. In many cases, they are Talmud, and what I'm discovering is that some of the material, we already know the stories from apocalyptic literature that has been preserved from late pre-Christian centuries or early Christian centuries. In other words, 2,000 years ago and more. I'll point out in verse 1, for people familiar with the traditional Jewish prayer book, it says, Anochi Magen Lach, in verse 1. Some of you are familiar with the Jewish prayer book. Does this Magen mean anything to anybody?
Mm-hmm. We have this in the Shemona Esrei.
The Shemona Esrei, the first blessing, the first paragraph ends Magen Abraham.
Mm-hmm.
And for the conservatives, but not for the Reform, who add a female reference, they take another reference that comes straight from Scripture, Poked Sarah. Okay, Rashi tells us that achar means that it was immediately after, and acharei, which means the same thing, tells you it might have been a long time afterwards. And so he's saying that after these incidents, it's not all the stories that we've had about Abraham to this point. It's only right after the story of Abraham fighting for one group of kings against the other in order to rescue his nephew. And Abraham is saying, maybe that's my reward that you promised me. And God says, according to that understanding, no, you're not going to be punished for everybody who was killed, and your reward is going to be very great. Don't worry about it. I think it's interesting that Abraham is worried, according to Rashi, that the people killed in war would be accounted to him as a negative, which is something we should think about. Even in war, in justified war, and the Bible clearly thinks that war was justified. The slaughter of combatants is still something one should worry about. In terms of Damasek Eliezer Damascus, there is some idea that he was originally from Damascus and some idea that he actually went to Damascus in order to be the general in Abraham's army and to beat back the kings. And the Talmud has a word that we give no tarikon, means that you make it as if it's an abbreviation. So DMSQ, Dole Umoshke, Mitorat Rabo La'acherim. And this is not that he serves Abraham, it's not that he was a general, but he gave people to drink from his master's teaching, that he was an assistant teacher who made Abraham's teachings, presumably about monotheism, accessible to everybody. And any one of those things might have made him worthy, according to this idea, to be Abraham's successor. Okay, let me go on with the text. So the text says that God is telling Abraham in a vision. Presumably Abraham is sleeping at night and he can go outside and he can see the stars. Now, I saw some people who said that the first part of this clearly was in the nighttime because he actually sees stars. But we also hear that this is a vision. Let me go up and show you that. After the words of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision, and this is machazeh. Machazeh in modern Hebrew is a play, but in the biblical Hebrew, that means a vision. So I suppose if you're sound asleep and you have a vision of God, you could have it during the daytime. Why is this important? Modern textual criticism likes to think about the biblical text as being different pieces that were put together for various reasons. And the rabbis thought in the same way. So some of the rabbis thought that the first part of this is going on at night, and the second part is going on in day, so they're clearly not the same. They use that to solve a computational problem. Last week, Simcha said, maybe you'll do some of Rashi's mathematics. And there's Rashi's mathematics in this, and Rashi's math assumes that verses 1 through 6 or 1 through 5 are at a different time than verse 7 and onward. In any case, he took him outside, he took him outdoors, he said, look at the stars, and said, those are the number of your descendants. Now, most of us would think of that as simply, you'll have a lot of descendants. You look up at the starry sky, especially if you are in remote places in Wyoming where they still have very little light, street lights and so on. Here in Denver and where I grew up in New York, you can't see as many stars. And Simcha was in Southern California for a while, where I'm sure that between the smog and the lights, Abraham would have looked up from Long Beach.
We didn't know what we were looking at.
Yeah, he looked up from Long Beach and said, I'm going to have a couple dozen at most.
Right.
In any case, but Rashi actually takes some material and says that that astrology will have no effect. And there are a lot of the stories which are sort of stereotypical astrology stories. Nimrod, the evil king, thought that he knew by astrology that Abraham would come and destroy his religion. And there are a number of other astrological stories. This particular one, Sarah was assumed to have no son because of the astrology. Again, this is Rashi, and Rashi is taking it off various sources. Nedarim is Talmud, Genesis Rabbah is what we call Midrash, and so on. Now, Professor Sweeney actually thought something very, very interesting. Normally, we think he believed in the Lord and he accounted it to him as righteousness, but we don't know what it and him are. And Sweeney argues that unlike the New Testament and unlike the rabbinic material, where we usually assume that Abraham is believing in God, and God, notice the capital He, God accounted this as righteousness to Abraham. Sweeney suggests that the Hebrew allows you to read that Abraham accounted this to God as doing righteousness. I find this fascinating. Sweeney does not say this right here, but in a narrative that we have in a couple of pages, the Abraham is made to tell God that you are not, oh God, you are not doing righteousness. When you're going to kill everybody in stone, is that just? And so again, I think that's a fascinating idea, one that I had never thought of until I read Sweeney's book. Okay, let's go back down. I'm sorry that the arrows are not working well. We were on verse 7. And now we have in a different subtext. V'yomer Elav, and he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you forth from Ur of the Chaldees to give you this land to inherit it. There is a lot of discussion about Ur meaning light. Ur is a historic city in southern Mesopotamia, and it actually has been excavated by the modern excavators in southern Iraq. And there are traditions, both Jewish and Islamic, that put Abraham's home as being much further north. In Kutha, which is someplace near Mosul, near Nineveh, and other locations in what today are northern Iraq, or even closer to the Syrian frontier. He said to him, I am the Lord who brought you forth from Ur. Ur also has a meaning of a furnace, and we'll see at least some things which we'll talk about a furnace here. O Lord God, how will I know that I will inherit the land? He said, bring me, and the translation here says 3 heifers, but the Hebrew says eglah mishuleshet, which is singular, ve'ez mishuleshet, ve'ayil mishulash, a threefold, and some translations translate this as a 3-year-old, as opposed to 3 of them.
Okay, so 3.
Rashi likes it being 3, and he assigns biblical references. 3 calves are 3 bulls. The bull of Yom Kippur, the bull for a sacrifice when the Sanhedrin doesn't know what to do, and the heifer whose neck was broken. For the Quranic experts, there is a chapter called Al-Baqarah, and that is not one of the cows that's mentioned in this particular commentary, but probably that commentary relates to a Mishnah passage in something called the Tractate Parah, which talks about all the different parot and parim, all the different cows that could have been sacrificed. He divided each one into 2 parts. You can read what Rashi had to say. The verse does not lose its simple meaning, but he said that this was part of the covenant to form, and you cut a covenant in Hebrew, and you cut the animals, although the Hebrew word for dividing them is not the same word as cutting for the covenant. He did not divide the birds, and Rashi suggests a reason why that is. And ha'ayit means the eagles in Hebrew, possibly the vultures. They translate this as the birds of prey, and gives you some references about why that might be. The Targums assume, the Targums are Aramaic translation, that this is a kind of mystic reference to the Israelites who are preyed upon by various kingdoms, the kingdoms, for example, of the book of Daniel. This Rashi doesn't talk about it. And then here we have Abraham drove them away. Vayashev, Nasab in Nashav is to blow. And Haruach Noshevet Krira, the wind blows cool. And he says that this is a messianic reference. Notice that before Abraham went out and saw the stars, but now the sun is ready to set. So obviously a different time. Okay, Rashi is still interpreting this as troubles and darkness and the time of exile. Know that your seed will be strangers in a land that is not theirs. This is where you have Rashi's calculations. Rashi says 400 years in terms of Egypt is impossible because in Exodus, you have a derivation of the ancestry of Moses. And if you take the total lifespan of Moses' father, grandfather, and great-grandfather, and assume that they became dads when they were 1 year old, you still don't have enough years for 400 years.
Mm.
And this is how Rashi has the calculations.
Mm.
And I have Seder Olam. I don't know whether I'll have time to show you Seder Olam in detail. So Rashi and most Jewish interpretation says this 400 years is not at all to be reckoned from the time that the Israelites went down to Egypt. Instead, it was from the birth of Isaac. Now, there's another text which says that it was 430 years. And the Jewish tradition assumes that this was 30 years before the birth of Isaac. That would make Abraham 70. That's my math. 100 when Isaac was born, minus 30, that's 70. But Abraham was 75 years old when he went to the land of Israel. So the rabbis do all sorts of calculations in order to have this part of the text earlier than the other one, saying that there is no before and after. In the Torah, sometimes the Torah is edited so that things fall in different places. Just make one more point about this. The beginning of our text has the Lord came to Abraham in a vision. This is the 4-letter name. And then over here, I am the Lord, the 4-letter name. But Abraham says, "O Lord God," and the 4-letter name is now God. So there's a different usage of the divine name, although it's still the 4-letter divine name. Mystics are very interested in which name means what. The 4-letter name, when it is pronounced the usual way, is usually associated with Tiferet. When it's pronounced different ways, it can be associated with all sorts of others of the Sefirot. I'm going to go on just a little bit to talk about this. You shall surely know that your seed will be strangers in a land, and the nation that they will serve, I will judge, and they'll go forth with great possessions. And here Rashi says the Vigam, and this is not only Egypt, but it's Babylon, Persia, and Media, and Greece, and Edom. All those things. Persia here and Media, those are referring to Cyrus, the great king, and that the Israelites would go out of Persia. And we'll see a few other references in the next couple of minutes. And then Abraham is told, "You'll come to your forefathers in peace," and the 4th generation. 4 generations in 400 years sounds like an awful long time, but it's justified because in the genealogy of Moses given in Exodus, Moses' great-grandfather went down to Egypt. And again, you can see that very quickly. And then sometimes people talk about 7 nations. Here you have 10 nations.
So,
Okay.
do we know what the sin iniquity of the Amorites was?
Yes. We don't know exactly what it was, but we know that it was not complete, and Rashi is not going to tell us.
Okay.
Okay, and now we have the sun was setting before, now it's totally dark. A smoking furnace and a firebrand pass between these parts. Zainab will know that the furnace in Hebrew is tanur. Do they have? I know tanur is used in Arabic. Is it used in Farsi?
Furnace. Can you say that name again?
Tanur.
Yeah, tanur, sure. We still use it.
Yeah, so tanur is a furnace, and here the furnace goes between the cut animals. They sacrifice either 3 animals of each type or 1 animal of each type, put them in half, and it is not Abraham going past the animals, but is the fiery furnace and the lapid esh, the firebrand. In modern Hebrew, lapid esh is a torch, and then the tanur ashan is the furnace, and they pass between these parts. And Rashi's comment on 17 is a grammatical one. Now, in Arabic, I think shams is the same thing. Shams can be masculine or feminine. In Hebrew, it certainly can be. Rashi's concerned that normally shemesh is feminine. It's one of these words that doesn't look like it's feminine, but it is. And again, Rashi's interpretation that this has to do with various kingdoms, and he gets this from a rabbinic interpretation. Mimi studied grammar with me. In Hebrew, she may remember, Simcha, you may also. Ba'a is that it has happened. Ba'a is it is happening. So none of us are well, for those of us who are not Hebrew experts, I'm not going to worry about it. The promise of land goes from Egypt to the Euphrates River in verse 18. And then, as I said, we fill out the 10 nations, not the 7 nations. Now, what do we make about this bit of the split animal and going between them? The Bible has an example from Jeremiah that is very close to the destruction of the temple. The reference in Jeremiah 34, I think, is to the last independent king of the Judeans. That would be approximately 580 something BCE, 587, 588, 589. Thus saith the Lord, you should not obey me. You would not obey me and proclaim a release. The issue is that the Tzidkiyahu proclaims release of all the slaves. The rich people of Judea released all their slaves, but then they went and re-enslaved them. And the prophet Jeremiah says this is a bad thing to do. So he says, I'm proclaiming your release, but your release is going to be from my protection to the sword, to the pestilence, and to famine. I will make you a horror to all the kingdoms of the earth. And you can read whatever he said. And then, like the calf which they cut in two so as to pass between the halves. The officers of Judah and Jerusalem, the officials, priests, and all the people of the land who passed between the halves of the calf shall be handed over to their enemies, to those who seek to kill them. Their carcasses shall become food for the birds of the sky and the beasts of the earth. So we have a very interesting parallel to the mystic vision of Abraham, in which he sacrifices the animals and the birds come down and they eat from the carcass. And this looks like it is the same kind of same kind of effort, as same kind of image as we have in Jeremiah. Now, I got a reference here from Ephraim Spicer in the Anchor Bible. And here's what he says. The smoking firepot and the flaming torch were not just fanciful inventions by the author or his immediate source. Both these details are recorded in Akkadian texts pertaining to magic, and they are listed together in an incantation against witches. I sent out against you repeatedly a lighted oven aliku tenuru, here's that word tenur again, and a fire that has caught, just like our instance. And he thinks it's very, very related to our material. But he also thinks that the slaying of animals and having a ceremony where the parties walk between the animals is also attested not only in Jeremiah but uh, in Akkadian texts. I have the page in Sweeney as well, and Sweeney has a totally different understanding about the torch and the smoking oven. He says the smoking oven is a reference to the incense which was burned on the external altar, which had a pleasing odor going up to God and smoke. And the torch would have been a reference to the menorah, to the seven-branch candelabrum, which was found in the temple as well. So that Abraham's vision is seen by Sweeney as Abraham catching a glimpse of the temple being the locale that would save the descendants of Abraham from being subservient to foreign nations. It's a very, very interesting idea. I like it a lot. I'm going to go on very quickly to some of the other ancient sources. This source is Seder Olam. I think that there's a translation online that I can copy, but I'm not so sure. It talks about all sorts of things, and in the middle, it begins to say, "O Yachol Dalad Arba Me'od Shana, Hayu Yisrael b'Mitzrayim v'lo kat miyordei Mitzrayim hayeh." Is it possible that there's 400 years? Kahat was in this same thing as the Rashi, and it gives us the reference. Ma Talmud Lomar. So why do we have this? Vavadum vanu inu otam arba ma'od shana. Maybe it means that they persecuted them for 400 years. So lulamed chasha kozman shezaracha ba'aretz lo lahem arba ma'od shana v'avadum elu me'ashir v'dud. It just tells you exactly what it is, and that's probably the most important source for this idea. Okay, Talmud Pseudo Jonathan is one of my favorites. I did the entire text. And so here you have this interpretation. The 4 kings had been slain and the 9 hosts brought back. Abraham reasoned in his heart. Notice he's not called Abraham yet. He's just Avram. Woe to me, because I already received my appointments in this world and I don't have any portion in the world to come. Or maybe the brethren of friends of those who will slay will combine and come against me. And so you see how that's worded. Abraham said, Lord God, great blessings you have given me, and great are they. Nevertheless, when I pass from the world without children, and Eliezer, the manager of my house, by whose hands signs were wrought, Eliezer of Damascus is the one who made the miracles happen. And you can see what it is. He said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of the fiery furnace of the Kasdim. And this particular text doesn't give you the story of the fiery furnace, but it's found in a lot of places. And I believe Chizkuni will give it to you, so I'm not going to talk about it yet. And then the deep sleep, and behold, the 4 kingdoms arose to enslave his children. And the Midrash, the interpreter, interprets each word as a separate kingdom. Terror, that's Babylonia. Darkness is Madai, that's the Medes. Greatness is Yavan, that is Greece. And decline is Firas. And our translator didn't say Persia, but I think the Firas over here are the Parthians. When Targum Jonathan was being written, the Parthians were in control, possibly the Sassanids, the Banu Sassan. That was what they call it in Farsi, Banu Sassan. Zainab?
Sorry, I'm just thinking about closest name to what you said.
So
but you said something. It was interesting. You said Yavan, right?
Yavan is Greece.
It's it's Greece because we have some more similar to it.
Right. The English is Ionia. It's like Ionic. That's Yavan. Like Wow becomes V. So Yawan became, or Ayan became Yavan in Hebrew. And Firas here is Persia, but as I said, I think that it says which is to fall, which would make this being during the time when the Persians were in control in Iraq.
Perhaps it used to be Fars because Fars is...
Yeah, right. And I think this reference to the Banu Sasan, to the Sassanids as we call them in English.
Oh, yes, Hassan. Yeah, I understood now what you say. Yes, Hassan. And Fars, is my ethnicity, race, Persia. Yes, Hassan,
So it's not at all surprising that Fars is referred to the Banu Sasan. Had they said the Sassanids, they will fall, it would have been very dangerous had they put that in the Aramaic. And then he said to Abraham, know that your son shall dwell in a land, etc., etc. And then here we say Abraham beheld Gehinnom, hell, Jahannam in Arabic, smoke with flaming coals and burning flakes of fire. This is not a temple reference. This is a reference to Gehinnom being between those divisions. And that's a reference to having, as Simcha said, the nations enslaving the Jews, descending into Gehinnom. And Josephus is not the source for this. Josephus reflects the source, but here you have what Simcha said. And then the Lord ordains a covenant with Abraham that he would not judge therein the sons and deliver them from the kingdoms, and gives them from the Nile to the river Firat. The Furat is the Euphrates. And then some other names over here, and there are the various countries. Chizkuni says, I am the Lord, and I started this from 15:7. All the sources I looked at wanted to look back to Adam and Eve and look forward. I am the Lord is the beginning of the Ten Commandments, although in Hebrew it's Anochi Hashem. And then who took you out of Egypt, the house of bondage. Here is who took you out of the fiery furnace or out of Ur of the Chaldees. In any case, he says, count the stars, and we have a paragraph known as Brit Ben Abitarim, the covenant between the cut up pieces. And here he says the revelation by daylight preceded the passage by 5 years. So again, I like to point out that modern scholars like to talk about different texts which somehow or other were put together in the Bible. Religious Jews were talking about this ages before. The methodology by which it happened is quite different, but the idea that there are different texts which are put together is not at all unusual. And then we have the idea of Abraham being 70 years old. And then we have a little bit more from the Seder Olam. Abraham was 40 years old at the time of the Tower of Babel, and then 13 years, the land known as the land of Canaan, and then they rebelled against Kedor Laomer, and that was 13 years, and then 26 years had elapsed between the tower had been destroyed, and then Abraham was 75 years old. Now, this mathematics is based on the idea that the Tower of Babel occurred at the time that an ancestor named Peleg died, because the biblical text says in those days the world was divided. And we know when Abraham was born from the biblical text, we know what the Bible says about the birth of Abraham. So it tells us he was born when somebody was whatever number of years old, and we can easily do the calculation back to the creation of the world. That's how these sources arrive at this mathematics. I didn't make up a chart. You can make up a chart if you want, and just follow it and so on. And so he sort of proves that Abraham had to go back and forth between Mesopotamia and Canaan multiple times in order to resolve all of these things. And when it says that Terach died, the last words of the previous Bible reading are Terach died in the Lecha at an age of whatever it was. The rabbis say it tells you that there because it wants you to learn a number of things. One of them is that Terach died an idolater, and the rabbis are not happy with idolaters. But it also says Abraham never saw his father again after the events when he was 75 years old. So there you have it. Here's an explanation of the covenant between the pieces and how he got it. And then I want to point out something. No, I'm not going to point anything out in Chizkuni other than that. The Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael also has something with Gehinom, but here Abraham has a mystic vision. Abraham, as it were, in his vision is taken to heaven and to hell, just like Jesus and Dante and Muhammad in some of the stories. Our father Abraham is shown Gehinom and the giving of the Torah and the splitting of the Red Sea from our passage. The smoking furnace is Gehinom, and he gives you some references. And the lit torch is the Sinai and the Red Sea. And the splitting of the Red Sea is the splitting of the animals. And the 3-year-old heifer is the whole order of sacrifices. So Abraham is given a vision which in the Bible means nothing of this. It probably is only a reference to the kind of thing that Jeremiah did. But in late antiquity, Abraham is shown hell. He's shown the entire future of his descendants. The Red Sea, Sinai, the sacrificial cult, and the temple. And the 4 kingdoms of Daniel chapter 7, as understood. And here's a reference to the 4 kingdoms. Daniel would not have known about the Banu Sasan. Daniel might have known about the Persians, and they would have been before the Greeks, just in terms of the time when Daniel was written. Rabbeinu Bachya was in the circles who were responsible for the Zohar, according to most modern scholars, in the 1200s, possibly earlier and later in the 1100s and 1300s. Rabbeinu Bachya, I think, is in the 1300s, working in Spain. He certainly is aware of a lot of Kabbalistic material. And I have this text only to give you an idea of what Rabbeinu Bachya said, but I don't want to read it in great detail. But here you have a story of how his father, Terach, by the way, the Arab tradition, I think, calls him Azar, the father of Ibrahim. But in Hebrew,
yes.
He's Terach.
Yes, it's true. Yeah, they call him Azar.
Yeah. So again, Zainab, I'm very happy you're here. I know some people say that why am I doing this, but I want to make sure that you know the references.
Yeah, you know things better than me, but I just wanted to prove what you said.
Right. And so you have a story. This is a story which is found all over the place. A version of the story occurs in the Quran. The earliest version probably is in a rabbinic period, early rabbinic period book called The Apocalypse of Abraham. I think is dated to the 2nd or 3rd Christian century. There's a version in the Midrash Rabbah. There's a version that was dated by Ibn Wahshiyah. Oh, Zainab, Ibn Wahshiyah, what does that mean?
Wahshiyah means like Khashiyah in Arabic means fear. Khashiyah, but how do you?
Wahshiyah. What's Wahshiyah?
Oh, means wild. Wahshi means wild.
Yeah. So Ibn Wahshiyah means the son of the wild woman or something like that.
Yeah, female. Yeah, it refers to a female.
Yeah. So I have no idea what it is, but that's what he's called. Ibn Wasiya said that he translated a book called Al-Falaha Nabatiya, the Nabatean Agriculture, from a work that was written in Aramaic in the 2nd century, which means it's about the same time. And there's a cycle of stories. Here's one of the versions of that story. Nimrod, Namrud in Arabic, Nimrod in Hebrew. Nimrod comes to Abraham's father. He's learned from astrology that Abraham is going to destroy the religion of Nimrod. And he says, I'll give you all the house full of gold and silver if you give me your child. And Terah quotes a story in which the horse is given a whole house of barley if the king can cut off his head. And the horse said, what good will the barley do me if you cut off my head? And Terah says, what good will all the silver and gold give me if you just kill my son? And he hides the baby in a cave for 3 years, and so on and so forth. And then Abraham left the cave, and he thinks, who had created heaven and earth? By the way, Zainab, you probably know a book by Ibn Tufail, which has the same kind of a thing, a human being who comes to an island in the wilderness and becomes a monotheist through this kind of philosophic speculation. Right? Do you know about Ibn Tufail? Hi, Ibn Yaqran? Yeah. So this is, as I said, this is a very famous story. I don't know whether this part of the story
you're right.
is in the Islamic text, but versions of it are formed in the Quran, and certainly Abraham arguing with the people and Abraham in the fiery furnace and thrown out by their references to the fact that they were aware of this story. So here, Abraham is, as Maimonides would say, a rational scholar. He says the moon can't be God because the stars and the earth and the sun and the wind and the so on, and you can read the entire thing. And then Abraham is asked by his father, who is an idolater and makes idols, what to guard the idols, and Abraham winds up destroying them. And he tells the people who come to buy idols, why are you buying an idol? This idol was made yesterday, and they can't do anything. And I like to tell the story. Lori is not here, and she knows that I tell the story this way. When I was a kid, I would tell the story that Abraham took a baseball bat and lopped off the heads of all the idols. And I gave a version of this lecture in Vancouver, and I was told very sharply by the people in Vancouver that a baseball bat just wouldn't do. It had to be a hockey stick. Well, what do you have? In any case, so Nimrod finds out about this, and Nimrod said, if you are such a great guy, we're going to have a test. I'm going to throw you in the fiery furnace. Remember, Ur was understood not only as a place name, but as a fiery furnace, and a miracle is performed for Abraham. Well, that is the story. Last week, we looked at the covenant made by God with Noah, and there are various versions of the covenant made by God with Abraham. The idea of a covenant relationship is very important in the Jewish tradition. The Hebrew word that's used for that is brit, and the brit par excellence comes to do with circumcision. And that comes out in a couple of chapters. We don't have that here. But the idea of covenant is so important that we have 3 covenant stories in this one passage in LechLecha. Whereas with Noah, we only have the one. Noah comes out of the boat, and God has a rainbow and says, I will never destroy the earth again. But here you have 7 laws. At least that's how the rabbis understood that. In this particular covenant story, God makes a covenant with Abraham. Maybe his fighting for his nephew was the source of it, maybe not. The usual understanding is that Abraham's faith in God was the source for it. And here God just gives him a vision, a mystic vision, That might be the temple, it might be the sacrifices, it might be the enemies of Israel going to hell, it might be all sorts of things. It also uses a motif that would have been familiar in antiquity. This is in the time of Jeremiah about creating a covenant and having the human beings pass in between. But the human beings don't pass in between here. The human parties to a treaty are not passing between the severed animals. Whatever they mean, it's the flaming torch and the smoking furnace that are passing in between, which I think has to be a very powerful image. And then we have one story about Abraham getting a son, but not the right son. And then finally, we have the story about the covenant, which has the Brit Milah. For Zainab's benefit, I'll mention that the Arabic term, that's the Quranic term for covenant, is not ahid, which is the term used by Sadia to translate Brit Milah, but mithaq.
Mithaq, yeah, means
Mithaq is and mithaq occurs a number of times, and Surah Al-Ma'idah, probably the latest of the chapters of the Quran. Zainab comes from a heavily Shia country. She probably knows Al-Yom Akmaltu Lakum Dinakum.
Yeah.
I have completed your religion for you. The reason this is important to Shias is because Shias understand that this is the last verse revealed, and it was revealed when Muhammad appointed Ali to be the Imam. Very important to Shia. And in Iran, being a Shia is a very important thing these days. It might not have been, say, in 1977, but today it's very important. So in the Quran, the word is mithaq, but the idea of mithaq also comes with the idea of loyalty and trustworthiness. The same ideas that Abraham exhibited in this particular passage, which I think is very nice. I'd like to do the comparative religion over there. It's about 6 o'clock. I spent an hour with this material. I'm probably going to do a little bit of editing on the sources, and then I'm going to send it to my Coffee Cups blog, drsethward.wordpress.com, if you want to see the edited material. I'm going to stop the share, and if anybody has any questions or comments.
Just one quick thing that came to mind, Seth. Thanks for the presentation today as well. When you're talking about sending the fire, whether it's torch, the furnace, whatever this fiery thing is that goes through, is kind of the opposite of the commandment not to send your children through Moloch, because here you have fire going through, the sacrifices rather than the sacrifices going in, passing through the fire. It's an interesting contrast to think about. It's something I was just thinking about towards the end of your talk today. All of a sudden, it just hit me about I never thought about it before. I've never heard it, but it's just an interesting contrast.
Well, I am glad that you thought about this. So this is Simcha Power. It's not the Rebbe. I love it. So if you're not aware of this, the Israelites, who were commanded according to the Torah, commanded only to worship God, clearly worshipped all sorts of things. And one of the worships that they did was Molech. And they talk about passing your children to Molech, whatever that means. Now, in Arabic, Malak sometimes means the angel of death. And for the, what are they called? The Yazidis, when they talk about Malak, that's sometimes considered to be Satan. So this is a very powerful idea. And Molech, the vocalization in Molech is to indicate that this is shameful. It comes from Boshet, from shame. We don't know what that means. It might have been burning up kids, but some people think that's exactly as simple as said, passing the kids between fires. And that's what it was. But whatever it was considered to be something that was very detestable. And the place where it was done was called Tophet, which means disgusting, and was also the valley of Ben Hinnom, which gave its name to Gehenna, or Jahannam in Arabic. So again, this is a really, really nice midrash. Whether or not it's true and means anything, I don't know, but I find it a very productive idea. I want to thank Matt for joining us today from my mysticism class. I hope that this was at least somewhat interesting.
Yes, there was a religion about 20 years ago where they actually had the children barefoot and walk through water, through fire.
Right. Well, there are all sorts of religions that go on. And I have to say, I would never have thought about this passage as being part of the mystic tradition until I read about it in Sweeney's textbook. So I'm very happy for that. And there you go. Okay, any other questions?
Well, I had a quick one. Just how come Abraham was worried about who was going to inherit when he had Lot?
That's a good question. It's one that we can ask. It's interesting that I know of no source that asks that question, that suggests that as an answer. Zainab had a question.
I didn't have any question about the text. Perhaps it's a little bit irrelevant, and sorry about that. But have you read GMT20201028, that work? That
I read a little bit of it. I haven't read it in a long, long time.
yeah, it's nice.
But Ibn Tufal, you probably read it.
Oh yeah, I know him. I know about that book and what it is written inside it.
Yeah, Chai ibn Yaqzan is possibly the model for either Robinson Crusoe or for the model of Robinson Crusoe. He winds up on an island, a lush island. He's brought up by animals, and through his own philosophic power, he comes to realize that there's one God, and he develops a kind of religious practice which sounds an awful lot like Islam.
Yeah.
And that's all not through revelation, but through reason, which is the point of that. And of course, you might say this is very heretical, because if you were to get up in the streets of Tehran today and say, well, we don't need Quran, we can learn everything we know from reason, just like Chai ibn Yaqzan, they might not be so happy. So I was laughing. You would probably not do that these days. Okay. Anybody else have anything to add?
No.
Well, I intend to do these things every week, as I've been doing for a while, but on Wednesday of next week, I will be traveling at the time that we usually meet, and in about a month, I'll be traveling. Cantor Neil has agreed to do the one in about a month. Simcha, you had told me you might be able to do next week, and let me confirm that that's something you can do.
Yeah, I can do that next week if you'd like. I can do something.
Okay. So I will.
On Haya Sarah. Bayera. Yeah.
And you can bring in stuff from the Rebbe if you want, or you can bring in your own ideas. And the only thing that I ask is that you have a little bit of Chumash with Rashi.
Yeah, of course. That's the center. That is always the mainstay.
It would be very difficult. And so next week I will try to be on the ball, but Simcha, you'll do it, and I will send it out to my list. Write me early in the day, because I'll be traveling later on in the day on Wednesday. And I'll send out the link with Simcha sends. It won't be my link; it will be Simcha's link, because I'll be traveling.
Okay.
Anything else?
No, just my little question.
I was glad to sit in on one of these.
Matt, is this interesting, useful, useless?
It is. Rashi doing every single little verse was very specific. I guess I wasn't expecting that much detail.
Well, first of all, I grew up with all of these things, so it doesn't seem at all strange. Second of all, the medieval Christian commentators did the same thing.
And I don't have any of those, so I haven't read those yet. It's
Right.
on the list.
And Jalalain has, and actually for that matter, Ibn Rushd, they all do the same thing. Every single word of the original, Ibn Rushd did this in Aristotle. Every single word of the original is copied, and for every 2 or 3 words, there's a comment on what it means. And so when Dante, for example, you heard of him, Dante Alighieri, who
I read the Divine Comedy.
who he finds Averroes in limbo because he was clearly deserving of a better fate than hell than Inferno. He calls him the great commentator. But that's how Averroes did his commentary. And Rashi, on every couple of words, they have something. Rashi does not give you every word of the text, whereas these Muslim guys very often did. The Jalalain, the Jalaluddin Sayuti, and the other Jalaluddin, his name escapes me right now. But that's the commentary tradition, is that you take every single word, you ask, this text is holy. If the text is holy, there are hidden meanings in every word. The Zohar does the same thing. Every word has its hidden meaning. It's holy. Clearly, if we assume that this is inspired or dictated by God, and God is infinite, there are infinite meanings in each word, and part of what we need to do is to get as many infinite meanings out as we can. And Matt, what you've seen from mysticism is that the goal is not to have the one meaning. The goal is to have as many ideas as you possibly can, which means if you want the one meaning, you're going to be left confused.
You're left confused anyway, but sure.
But the purpose is not, it's not to give you a single meaning. It's to give you as many meanings as you possibly can. Look at this interesting meaning. Look at this interesting meaning, and maybe it means that. Because remember, God is infinite. God is one, but also infinite. If we only have one meaning in our finite world, we're not really getting to the truth about God. We need to have infinite meanings. And again, it may not make you very happy if you want to know what it means. But if you want to have a relationship with something that's infinite, having infinite meanings should make you happy. How's that for some philosophy?
No, I like it. I agree.
Okay, folks, I think we've done a little bit more than an hour. Thank you very much for joining me.
Well, thank you for doing it.
I will be traveling to New Orleans on Wednesday of next week to meet my granddaughter, who will not yet be a month old. So you can say Mabruk. Does it say Mabruk in Farsi?
I understand. It's not common in Persian, but yeah, I understand. Mabruk, Mubarak. You say Mubarak.
It's Mubarak in Farsi. So whatever
I
it
know
is.
it's Arabic, but however, it is common.
Yeah. So there it is. So I hope you will accept that as my excuse for not being able to be with you next week.
Oh.
And I scheduled it so that I would not miss any of my teaching. So the teacher will go on by Zoom, just from a different location. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good.
See you Tuesday.
Bye-bye.
Bye.